I'd like to begin this evening with a poem by David Wagoner called Lost. And it's based on a teaching a Native American elder might give a young boy or girl on what they should do if they got lost in the forest. Stand still. The trees ahead and the bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger. Must ask permission to know it and be known. The forest breathes. Listen. It answers, I have made this place around you. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. So it's been a pleasure meeting with everybody today. Yesterday and this morning and today we've been talking about cultivating an awareness of what's most important. And we're all at different stages of that, different sensations of that, different experiences of that. Many of you have a very clear sense of what's most important, and some it's a dim sense and there's some fear and I'm not sure, and others may not even be the right question to ask at this time. Honoring that. But now we're going to begin to look at the whole question of once we do have a sense of what's most important, how do we then align our lives so that it's in alignment with what's most important? We might look at our lives and say, wow, that's nothing like what's most important to me at this time. How do I get from here to there? So this evening's talk is a kind of grab bag of different considerations. I hope that somewhere in there you might find a few gems that will help guide you. I brought in this poem, Lost, largely because there is this sense that when we're trying to make something happen, we're trying to force something on the world, when we have this idea about what we should be or who we should be, and we try to make it happen, we're often lost, especially when the world doesn't respond in the way we think it should. In those times, it becomes really important to move from what we might call doing mode to being mode, to just letting ourselves be and let the world find us. Let what's most important find us. We're all very familiar with doing, we have lists of things to do and we get them done, and that's all well and good when we know what to do, when it's been done already before, when we don't have kind of internal resistance that we're not quite sure how to navigate. But when we do have those internal resistances and when we aren't quite sure how to proceed next, it often becomes helpful to learn and grow out of what we might call being mode. Children do this all the time, you know? Just imagine a child learning to speak, right? How do they do it? Right? They're in a particular environment and all these people are saying things and words and all this stuff, and somehow that somehow gets in and they start repeating stuff and they're terrible at it, but they just keep doing it. There's no objective. They just keep speaking, and eventually over time they learn how to speak. That's learning by being. You're in an environment, you let the environment work on you. Learning by doing would be if the child said, I need to learn 10 new words by Friday. Invariably, they'd miss out, they wouldn't do it, they'd start berating themselves, and they'd never learn how to speak. That's why changing habits is so difficult. We tend to think that our conscious mind is so powerful, but it's not. It's nimble, but it's not powerful. Not certainly compared to the subconscious processing, which guides pretty much everything we do all day long. I'll give you an example. They did a research study where in one room, people were given a number to memorize, either a 2-digit number or a 7-digit number. Then they had to go down the hall to another room where they had to report the number. The actual experiment, though, happened in the hallway, where an assistant, wanting to thank the people for participating in the experiment, was going to give them a little gift. They could either have fruit or cake. And it turned out, generally speaking, that those who had the 2-digit number tended to go for the fruit, and those who had the 7-digit number tended to go for the cake. Now, why would that be? Right? You might think that, okay, well, fruit's better for me. I shouldn't be eating cake. So my conscious mind is going to steer me to the fruit until the conscious mind is overtaxed. And then the subconscious processing, the instinct takes over and they go for the cake. And what does it take to make the conscious mind be overtaxed? Memorizing a 7-digit number. So just think about everything in your life, all your responsibilities, whether it be work or family or all sorts of other things that happen, crises happen. Way more taxing on the conscious mind than memorizing a 7-digit number. So you can see why our habits are so difficult to change. We can think of the subconscious mind as rock and the conscious mind as water. And it's true that water can eventually erode away rock, but it has to do it over and over and over again. So in a similar kind of way, we can begin to change from where we are to where we want to go. But the only way we can do that is by creating our intentions and nurturing our intentions over and over again. Now, it's also true that as we nurture our intentions, that we have to have patience, that we have to have kindness for ourselves, because it takes time, you know? Holding an intention is like planting a seed. You can't simply will the seed to grow and become a plant. It doesn't work that way. It has its own timetable. We talked about this, experimented with it yesterday. But you can keep nurturing the plant so that it's more likely to grow. And in a similar kind of way, we can nurture what's most important by keep replenishing, coming back to our intention again and again and again. And I'm going to talk more about that a little bit later in the talk. But nevertheless, I hope you can see that if we're patient and kind and not grasping, that over time we find our way. Give you another example from my life. I was, I was teaching high school for many years, and I think I told you yesterday that I decided to teach high school until I figured out what I really wanted to do. And I did try all kinds of things. I tried, writing music. I tried acting. I actually represented somebody as a lawyer once. I became a minister, all sorts of things. None of them really stuck. So I kept teaching. That actually was the best fit for a long time. One of the things that really drew me, though, was the idea of becoming a therapist. I had had very good experiences with therapy in my 20s. It's powerful, been really helpful. So, as part of teaching, you have to go back to graduate school. And I didn't think getting a degree in education was really what I wanted to do. So I ended up getting a degree in social work, which was a lot harder. And I thought, well, I'll just become a therapist. I'll transition from teaching to doing therapy. But everything I did in terms of, trying to get field placements and, whether it was personal field placements or working in corporation field placements, they didn't take me. Essentially, I wasn't ready. I really, really wasn't ready. Not emotionally fully ready to be a therapist, to handle the challenges of other people and their emotional experiences. And that was back well over 20 years ago that I thought I wanted to be a therapist. I ended up finally getting my field placement in community organizing, in education, by the way. Some 15, 20 years later, I find myself in a very different position. Things have happened along the way, all kinds of experiences that I put myself through and in have trained me in certain kinds of ways that if I were to be a therapist now, I'd know exactly what to do. I work with people individually in mindfulness mentoring. And a lot of the time, what we're working with are the kinds of emotional experiences that I would have done if I'd been a therapist. It took a long time. It took some patience, but there was continued growth. So we never know how things will happen if we keep nurturing our intentions. Okay, so I'd like to talk about now the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Now, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, if you take it literally, is about what happens when you die, what happens in the period between lifetimes, and then getting reborn. Maybe you believe in past lives and future lives, maybe you don't. I don't know. Doesn't really matter. Because what's really important about the experience is that we go through these deaths, these places of, well, I'm going to call it, the word is the bardo, but the place of uncertainty and rebirths fairly often enough through our lifetimes. And what the Tibetan Book of the Dead is really offering is how do we navigate that skillfully? So the first thing to recognize is that, something is leaving. Some old way of being is leaving. And then we're in a period where we don't know what's happening yet because the new hasn't come yet. And then we move in finally to a period where the new is arriving. So, how do we navigate all that? The first part is how do we navigate the recognition that something that we were attached to is leaving? So, it becomes important first to, as best we can, let go of attachment, recognizing that what is leaving is leaving. The Buddha talks about us, letting go of certain teachings. He says, a certain teaching is like a raft that gets you across a river. But once you get to the other side of the river, you don't want to keep dragging the raft around with you. You want to let it go. But that's not always easy. We have generated years, perhaps decades of attachment to whatever might be going. We have generated a whole set of programming in our subconscious mind that knows how to live with things a certain way, whether it's people in our lives, whether it's the work that we do, whether it's the traumas that we've had and experienced, whether it's the view of ourselves. We've lived for a long time knowing how to live with that, attached to that. So it's very hard to just suddenly cut the ties. We try to, many people, in this pandemic, for instance, I've known some people who have realized, okay, I have a business. I had this business for a long time. With the pandemic, I can't have the business anymore. So I'm cutting my ties and I'm going to figure out the next thing. But what they're missing is that there's a whole well of grief that needs processing. Talked with several people today, and as we were talking, a lot of sadness was coming up. But there is often a tendency to just kind of blow by sadness. I'm sad, but I'm not really going to acknowledge it because there's other things more important and I got to get to them. Each of our emotions has a direction and has a purpose. So anger has a direction of forward. It's about taking care of things, fixing things in the outside world. Fear has a direction of backwards. It's about protection and not engaging in places that are unsafe. Happiness is up. That's a sense of growth. I'm ready for whatever's new. And sadness is down. Grief is down. It took me a while to figure out what the purpose of grief was, the purpose of sadness. It seems kind of strange because what it really does is it pulls us out of our daily lives. It pulls us out of engaging. Why would we be designed to do that? Because it's one of the natural emotions. And on contemplation, and I've never read this anywhere, but my sense of it is the purpose of sadness is because there's loss. And with the loss, there has to be a detachment from all the ways that we were connected to whatever's been lost. And only when that happens can we begin to open up to new connections, new ways of being. So sadness is super, super important. We can't really grow until we fully let go of what was lost or what is moving on. So it becomes important to really acknowledge our sadness, to be with our sadness, to let it express until such time as it releases. And then we're ready to move on. Some of you may have seen the movie Inside Out. If you haven't seen it, it's worth watching. It's essentially about the interior emotions of a little girl. The little girl has basically had to move from where she was living once before and now to some new place. And she's trying to make friends and, all of that. And inside her head are all the different emotions, right? There's joy, there's sadness, there's anger, there's fear, there's disgust. Mostly the story is about the relationship between joy and sadness. Because essentially what starts happening is sadness starts touching things within her system, and it starts having an effect on her. She starts to not feel good about how things are going. But the joyful part, she thinks she's supposed to be joyful all the time. So joy is trying to fix everything, right? And from the essence of the little girl, what's ending up happening is she's out there trying to be her joyful self with everybody and trying to get on I think it's a hockey team or whatever it is, doing this all thing in the whole world just to try to avoid the experience of sadness, which is not uncommon. We do that. Ultimately, though, sadness does have the capacity to halt the process. And at some point, you see the little girl, after she's had some misfortunes, just really, really cry into her parents' hugs. And with the crying, everything cleared. So there is that sense that when we can really be with our sadness, be with our grief, hold it, be kind to it, touch it, love it, give it its time, it eventually clears out and we're ready for what's new. Now, having said that, especially if there's been trauma that's mixed in with whatever loss that we're experiencing, it makes everything more complicated. And we have to go in and touch the sadness a little bit and move out. And then touch the sadness some other time a little bit and move out. Or there may be other things that we have to do in order for that grieving to actually occur. We may not be ready immediately, but please know that over time, there is great value in letting ourselves grieve our losses. Okay. The second part of the Bardo, the second part of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the letting go of what is lost, is then we are resting in a period of uncertainty. We don't know what's coming next. I don't know about you, but I've been in periods of uncertainty where I've just tried grasping for maybe this will work, maybe this will work, maybe this will work. And invariably, none of that works. In essence, we can think of this period of uncertainty as like a caterpillar in a chrysalis or a cocoon. There is a sense of growth, but it's not obvious to the outside world. What is invited when we're in this period of uncertainty is to stay really, really present, to just notice everything that's going on with us and try not to grasp or trying to make things happen. Because things will happen when we're ready and when the outside world is ready for them to happen. Until then, we can grasp, but chances are it will be unsatisfactory. And we just stay present as best we can. And then finally, when whatever is new is starting to arise, there's a kind of natural flow to it, an opening up. But once again, we want to know that it's helpful not to grasp for whatever's arising. letting the growth be out of being and not so much out of doing. Okay, so that's one area. We want to be, as best we can, practicing growth and change out of being. We've got this transition period that we work with. It's important to grieve what's lost, give ourselves time for that. Okay, the next thing I'd like to talk about is, working with fear. So some of the folks that I talked with today, and this is very common, we have a sense of where we want to go, but we don't go there. And we say, well, fear keeps that from happening. I would invite that there's really another way to look at it, which is that we have competing desires. One desire is for something that's we're moving forward towards, but another desire is for what's already here, that it has its place. So we'll talk about the conflicting desires in just a moment, but let me talk about fear for a moment. To a large degree, fear is intelligent. We want to respect our fear. Now, when I say fear is intelligent, I'm not saying that fear is something that reasons things out. It's not intelligent in that kind of way. But what fear is telling us is what we're not yet ready to do, what we're not yet ready to engage in. So I was a chemistry major. I think I told you that. There is if any of you remember chemistry, if you're going to have a chemical reaction, you start with the reactants over here with low potential energy. And then they had this thing called an activation energy. So it was like like a hill. And at the very top was the activation energy, and then it goes to the other side, and on the other side are the products, right? If a chemical reaction happens, it start with things that you start with, and then the reaction occurs, and you end up with things that you get, right? Now, the thing is, in between what you start with and what you get is this activation energy, which means that a lot of chemicals are very stable, being just what they are. And making the product isn't so easy. So what you have to do, one way to make the product is to give a lot of energy to the original materials, usually by adding heat or adding pressure, whatever. You give it a lot of energy and it gets it over the hill, right? So that's kind of like the impetus for us to engage in the world, for us to, engage in what's most important, that energy that we have, okay? The activation energy, the barrier, if you will, is the fear. And as long as the fear is bigger than the energy that we give the original products, the energy that we give to our impetus, the fear is bigger than the impetus, we're not going to change. We're not ready yet. So there's two ways to make that change occur. One way is to amp up the impetus, right? That's we can do by homing in our intention again and again and again. That's one way. It's often challenging to do that. It takes a lot of energy. The other way is to begin to lessen the fear, to bring the fear down. And that's a lot of where mindfulness practice and inquiry practice comes in. We'll talk about that some more today and tomorrow. But the more we can untangle from the things that are bringing us fear, the beliefs that we're holding, the messages that we got, the old hurts and wounds that we don't want to touch, traumas that occurred, all of those things, as we untangle from them or discharge them, our level of fear comes down. And then once the fear comes down, the impetus is enough to get us over the hump. But it's not valuable to say, oh, the fear is keeping me from doing it. The fear is bad. If only I wasn't so afraid. Because the fear is intelligent. The fear is telling us that there are things we need to do before we're ready for change. And we work on that. And over time, that fear does come down, and then change does occur. Okay. So, in relationship to that, we often have conflicting desires, as I said, right? We have this impetus for where we want to go, but we're not going there because where we are has its value too. And we tend to think that it's an either or experience. It's either A or B. I either go or stay. And that's all there is, just those choices. That's actually a bit of a fallacy. There's many, many ways that our lives can continue. But it first takes really honoring each of these choices. So I'd like to do a little practice with all of you now. I'll invite you to go ahead and find yourself in a suitably meditative position. Doesn't have to be super upright or anything like that. I invite you to close your eyes. And what I'm going to ask you to engage in, some of you have this to engage in and others of you don't, but if you don't, I'll invite you to imagine or think of a time when this occurred in the past. Maybe resolved now, but think of a time when it occurred in the past. So I'd like you to consider some conflict in your mind from the perspective of choice. Do I do A or do I do B? Do I move to something new or do I stay with what I have? Usually that's what the choice is, something like that. And even if it's not a very big choice at this moment, if you could go through the experience with us, just so that you get the idea of it, so that when these larger conflicts do occur, you'll have a better idea of what to do with them. So what I'll invite you to do is imagine a bowl, a big bowl in your mind. And each of these choices, stay or go, yes or no, imagine them as a ball, each one its own ball, or maybe an image that represents it. Don't make it too complicated. But we're placing them both in the bowl together. And now what I'll invite you to do is move to the one that feels like future oriented. You know, the one where there's an impulse, a desire to move in that direction. And I'll invite you to sense into what is it you appreciate about this choice? What is it that draws you in this particular direction? And as you become aware of all the aspects that draw you in this direction, I'll invite you to feel the experience in your body as best you can. What's it like when I engage in all of these benefits from this choice? Let that sink in to the subconscious processing, which is engaged by engaging the felt sense in the body. And now I'll invite you to move off in the other direction. The sort of what's already here kind of direction. And I'll invite you to check in with what draws you in this direction. What is it you appreciate? We often think of, the old as holding us back. But there's a reason that we appreciate something here. There's something we want. There's some value here. And as we sense into that value, once again, feeling that in the body. What's that like? Honoring what's here. And then I'll invite you to move back to the first choice. And now asking the question, if I choose this, what would I have to be okay with? What would I have to tolerate? Because every choice we make, there are sacrifices. What would I be sacrificing? And can I be okay with that? What would it be like to just be with the sacrifice of what's being let go of? And then moving back to the second choice again and asking the same question. If I were to choose this, what would I have to be okay with? Can I be okay with that? What would that feel like? And then we simply come back to the middle. We hold both experiences together in our awareness. We simply rest there. What we've had the opportunity to explore is what draws us in each direction, what we'd have to give up in each direction. And out of that, maybe during the meditation, but maybe much later when you're not even thinking about it, when you're walking the dog, it'll come to you. Maybe one of these will be the choice that you make. Maybe there'll be some way of incorporating the qualities of each in some new way of being. One that maybe you hadn't really considered yet. We let our sense of what comes next emerge out of honoring all of what we're experiencing. Okay. So we've talked about fear and a little bit about bringing down fear. One of the ways that we bring down fear is related to the environment we put ourselves in. There's a phrase in AA, my social work days, I did one practicum as a working with drug addiction, alcohol addiction. And so I learned a few things there. And one of the phrases that one of the therapists would use comes from AA. She says, there's a quote that goes, "If you spend enough time in a barber shop, sooner or later you're going to get your hair cut." Now, what she was using that phrase for was basically to argue that if you spend enough time in a bar, because even though you're not drinking, that's where all your friends are, sooner or later you're going to get a drink. Your environment matters. But it's also true that if you have an intention, an aspiration, something that's important to you, that when you get into an environment where that is fostered, encouraged, over time, you start to pick up those qualities. The messages just subtly get in. And much of the things that you may have been afraid of to begin with, you start getting less and less afraid of them. You start to just find yourself naturally moving in the direction of what's most important. There's a famous story from the Buddha. You know, the Buddha, on his night of enlightenment, basically had to battle all of the, excuse me, wrong story. The story goes that Ananda, the Buddha's attendant, came to the Buddha and said, "It seems to me that the Sangha, the community, is half the holy life. How important the Sangha, the community, is." And the Buddha said, "No, Ananda, that's not correct." He said, "The Sangha, the community, is all of the holy life." And what he really meant by that was, by being in this community of like-minded people with this Buddha who knows, how to wake up, all these people were waking up because of the influence of where they were. What environment you place yourself in matters. A very mundane example of that, grew up in New York State, near Rochester, New York. I came to Maryland to start a teaching career. And within a few years, I was talking to my parents, talking to my brother. They were all amazed about how much I knew about politics. And I'm like, I don't know anything about politics. I don't engage in politics. But just being in the environment, you pick stuff up. You pick up messages. We all do. Our subconscious minds are like sponges for the messages around us. So to the degree that we're capable of choosing our environment, finding environments that foster what we are finding to be important and valuable, we will find our fear getting less, our impetus getting stronger, and we're more and more likely to find ourselves engaging in what's most important to us. Another phrase, this one from Rumi. He says, "Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it and embrace them." Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it and embrace them. Now, we could put in place of love whatever is most important, whatever has arisen for you. because that impetus is already there. What's most important is already in you. It wants expression. Your job is to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you've built against it. Once again, what we're talking about is dismantling all the aspects of fear, all the aspects of resistance. But we don't do it by trying to crush it. We do it by embracing, by holding. Now, this is the process of RAIN, the process of inquiry. RAIN is a meditation we'll do tomorrow for those of you who don't know what that means. It means recognize, allow, investigate, and ultimately getting to a place of non-identification. And I'll explain what that means tomorrow. But all you need to know is that we're doing deep self-inquiry. We're inquiring. Okay, I sense this impetus for something, and I also sense that there are barriers. Let me seek to find them within myself. And as I embrace them, they start to dissolve in their own kind of way. They start to dissolve. So I'll just put that in as a placeholder, as a piece of how we navigate moving towards what's most important. We'll do that in the meditation tomorrow. So I'd like to come back full circle to living from intention, nourishing our intention, remembering what's most important over and over again without clinging to it, right? Intention is like the top of the mountain. I know that's where I'm going, but I'm not going to cling to that. It just stays in my consciousness. And then I look at what's the next step. So one of the ways that we can nourish our intention is by imagining ourselves in our meditation living from that intention, living from what's most important. You may be familiar with athletes. There's some athletes that, have been engaged in meditation. What are they meditating on? Well, maybe they're meditating on calmness. That's certainly important. But often what they're meditating on is watching themselves go through a particular maneuver. And they're watching different, opponents coming in different ways, and they're figuring out how they're going to do the maneuver under these different conditions. And what they discover is it's almost as valuable as going through the maneuvers themselves, physically. There's something about the mental practicing in this meditative state that essentially is programming the subconscious mind for better performance. And so that's what I'm going to invite us to do now. I'm going to do another little practice. So what I'm going to invite you to do is go ahead and find yourself in a meditative position. And I'll invite you to sense as best you can whatever's important to you. And I'll invite you to consider a situation, maybe in the past, that didn't go how you wanted it to. That you weren't your best self. You weren't interacting in a way that was in line with what was most important to you. Something you have regret for. Now, the first thing to do is to recognize that there's a difference between regret and guilt. Regret is some degree of sadness that things went the way they did, and perhaps a certain degree of a sense that I want to do things different in the future. That's regret. Guilt is things didn't go the way I wanted. I didn't behave the way I would have liked if I had been more ready. And I'm bad and wrong for it. So I need to be punished. The guilt is not so helpful. It's important to remember that no matter what we did, we were doing the best we could with what we had available to us at the time. We've had all kinds of experiences in our lives. We have certain genetics that give us predispositions. All of that's gone into how we see ourselves and how we see the world. Maybe there were stressful things happening, so our conscious mind wasn't quite so online. Whatever it was, we did the best we could with what we had available at the time. Now, because of that result, we have more experience. Looking back, we would do something different, of course. But we've got to let go of the punishment because we were doing the best we could with what we had then. So I'm going to invite you, just a little practice here. I'm going to invite you to hold remorse in one hand. Put your hands together. And hold remorse in one hand. And hold guilt in the other hand. And you can hold the hand with remorse in front of you, but then let the hand that has guilt slowly move off to the side. Move off to the side. Just keep moving. Just slowly move away. Letting the guilt move farther and farther away, eventually extending your arm out fully. And then turning your hand over and dumping it. That might take practice, but it's worth the practice. So we have a situation where you experience some remorse. Things didn't go how you wanted them to. So what I'm going to invite you to do now is see the situation a little more clearly in your mind's imagination. And we're going to practice just being mindful. What's it like to really just be there? So I'll invite you to start with noticing, as if you were there right now, what's happening in your body, the emotions that are happening in your body. Maybe there's fear, maybe there's hurt, maybe there's anger, maybe there's all three. Maybe there's discomfort. Just kind of feeling the sensations in your body, keeping the attention out of your head for a little bit, and realizing that no matter what sensations you're feeling, from the body's perspective, they're just sensations. They're nothing the body can't handle, and the body doesn't judge them. You might also notice some of the other sensations of the body, like your feet, perhaps in shoes or touching the floor. You might notice that there's sensations of clothing against your skin. And sensation of air. And your muscles are contracting in order to maintain the position you're in. There's a lot of different sensations, not just the emotional sensations. We have a tendency to focus on what's wrong. It's called the negativity bias. But there's a whole lot more going on than that. You might also begin to notice the state of your mind. Just kind of watching it. Imagine that you are taking a few steps outside your mind. And just watch the mind. What's it doing? Is it offline? Is it running around like in a hamster wheel? Is it calm? Is it super focused? It's kind of noticing. Hmm, interesting. Then becoming aware of your environment. So there may be some other being or beings or some object that you're engaging in. But I'd like you to start by noticing everything else. Notice the room, notice the walls. If you're inside, if you're outside, notice whatever the environment is outside. There's a whole lot more going on here. Are there other people in the environment that maybe don't have anything to do with what's going on? You're just there. You might become aware of this other being. I'm going to assume it's another being, may not be, but whatever it is, and just kind of notice facial expression and posture. You might even have a little bit of an idea of what's going on inside them. There's probably some obvious emotion that's here, but there may be some subtle underlying emotion too. Maybe there's some sense that they're believing that somehow they're not safe, or somehow they're not worthy, though they wouldn't necessarily know that consciously. You might get a sense of what they're needing and what you're needing. Okay. So we've become a little bit more mindful of the experience. And now I'll invite you to sense into, in this interaction, what was your automatic intention? What was the intention you had without thinking about it? And then asking yourself, is that my highest intention? What's most important? When I get right down to it, what's most important? To whatever degree I can discern that. And so now I'm going to invite you to replay the situation in a new way. I'll invite you to replay the situation coming into it from a place of what's most important, from a place of your highest intention. And then staying as mindful as you can, mindful of your own experience, mindful of the experience of anyone else and the environment. Play it out in a new way. Play it out in a way that's more in alignment with your highest intention, with what's most important. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. So we took a look today at a lot of different aspects of what it's like to start to align our lives with what's most important. We remember that there's a process of letting go of the old, which may include engaging in grief and sadness for what's being lost. A process of a period of time where there's uncertainty, unknowing, in which case we try not to grasp for trying to make something happen, having faith and trust that what's coming is coming when it's ready. We looked at the issue of fear, recognizing that our fear is intelligent. It tells us what we're not yet ready to engage in, and that the way we work with fear is to find ways to dismantle it, to bring it down, to dismantle the pieces that are keeping it in place. And that can happen in a variety of ways. One way it can happen is by simply finding an environment that fosters or encourages the direction we want to go. Or we might sense that we can hold our conflicting desires together, honoring them all and seeing what emerges. Or we do deep internal inquiry that looks for all the barriers within ourselves that we've built and embrace them. And finally, we just keep nurturing our intention. One way is to just keep remembering the intention, but another is to deliberately practice in our meditation time to begin to retrain our subconscious mind by imagining ourselves living from our highest intention in our daily lives. So I'd like to close with a poem by Jennifer Wellwood called Unconditional. Willing to experience aloneness, I discover connection everywhere. Turning to meet my fear, I meet the warrior who lives within. Opening to my loss, I gain the embrace of the universe. Surrendering into emptiness, I find fullness without end. Each condition I flee from pursues me. Each condition I welcome transforms me and because becomes itself transformed into its radiant, jewel-like essence. Thank you for your kind attention and your practice, your participation this evening.